The market's shadows. The air in Meadow Ridge carried the faint scent of early summer, fresh-cut grass, blossoming flowers, and the earthy aroma of ripe produce. Mary Hartwell stood by her wooden stand at the bustling farmer's market, her weathered hands carefully arranging baskets of tomatoes and peaches. At 65, she had the kind of presence that commanded quiet respect, her silver hair tied back in a neat braid. Years of running the family farm alone had given her a strength that radiated from her sharp blue eyes and unyielding posture. "Morning, Mrs. Hartwell," called out Mr. Adler, the town's baker. He tipped his wide-brimmed hat and motioned toward her display of vegetables. "Best tomatoes in the county, as usual." Mary smiled warmly. "You know me, Adler. If it isn't perfect, it doesn't leave my farm." The market hummed with life. Children chased each other between stands, vendors called out their specials, and the occasional squeal of a pig or cluck of a chicken punctuated the chatter. Meadow Ridge was a small town where everyone knew everyone, and Saturday mornings at the market were as much about catching up with neighbors as they were about shopping. Mary glanced down at her phone, an old flip model that seemed out of place in an era of smartphones. It vibrated softly, and her lips twitched into a faint smile. A message from Eric, her son, flashed on the screen. "All good here. Miss you, Mom. Be safe. Love, E." Her smile faded into a shadow of concern. Eric Hartwell wasn't just her son. He was a Navy SEAL, stationed halfway around the world. While she was proud of him, the constant worry about his safety gnawed at her. Still, he'd insisted on leaving her with a second phone, a sleek satellite model with only one number programmed. Just in case, he told her, his tone serious. She'd never had to use it, and she hoped she never would. Her thoughts were interrupted by a low rumble that seemed to vibrate the ground beneath her feet. The noise grew louder, a grating roar that silenced conversations and made heads turn toward the main road. A column of motorcycles rolled into the market square, engines growling like a pack of predators. There were 8 of them, their riders clad in leather jackets adorned with a sinister emblem, a jagged wave with a skeletal face at its crest. The iron tide had arrived. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Parents pulled their children closer, vendors froze mid-sale, and a nervous tension rippled through the crowd. The iron tide was no stranger to small towns like Meadow Ridge. Rumors followed them like storm clouds: intimidation, extortion, and violence. No one knew their true purpose, but wherever they went, trouble followed. The lead rider pulled up near Mary's stand and dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a shaved head and a jagged scar running from his temple to his jaw. His leather vest bore the name Axel Kane, stitched in bold letters, along with the title President. Well, Axel drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. "A quaint little market. Fresh fruits, homemade pies. Quite the slice of Americana." Mary kept her gaze steady, refusing to show fear as Axel approached. He picked up a tomato from her stand, examining it with exaggerated interest before taking a bite and spitting it onto the ground. "Not bad," he said, smirking. "You've got a good thing going here, lady. Be a shame if anything disrupted it." "What do you want?" Mary asked, her voice calm but firm. The market had gone silent, all eyes on the confrontation. Axel tilted his head as if considering her question. "Protection," he said finally. "See, times are tough. Roads are dangerous. Accidents happen. For a small fee, we make sure nothing bad happens to your little market here." Mary's hand tightened around a crate of peaches, but her expression didn't waver. "We don't need your protection." Axel's smirk faded, replaced by a cold glare. He stepped closer, invading her space. "Careful, lady. It'd be a shame if you found out the hard way how wrong you are." Behind him, the other bikers spread out, leaning against their motorcycles or loitering near other stands. The tension was palpable, and no one dared to intervene. Sheriff Bill Timmons, Meadow Ridge's aging lawman, finally emerged from the crowd. He rested one hand on his belt and cleared his throat. "This is private property. Fellas, best you move along." Axel turned slowly, his expression amused. "And who's going to make us? You and that pea-shooter on your hip." Bill's jaw tightened, but he held his ground. "You're not welcome here." Axel chuckled, motioning to his gang. "Hear that, hoys? We're not welcome. Guess we'll just have to change that." He turned back to Mary. "Think it over, Grandma. We'll be back to discuss terms." The gang roared away as suddenly as they'd arrived, leaving a cloud of dust and unease in their wake. Mary's hand shook as she rearranged the scattered produce on her stand. Around her, the market buzzed with hushed whispers. Fear had taken root, but so had something else. Determination. Sheriff Timmons approached, his face lined with worry. "Mary, I don't like this. The iron tide doesn't take no for an answer." "I'm not backing down, Bill," Mary said firmly. "This is our town. We don't bow to bullies." "You've got guts," the sheriff said, "but guts won't stop them from coming back." Mary's hand drifted to the satellite phone in her apron pocket. She hadn't told anyone about it, not even Bill. Eric had made her promise to use it only in an emergency. Was this such a time? She didn't know, but the seed of doubt was growing. By the time the market wound down for the day, Mary's resolve had solidified. She returned to her farmhouse on the outskirts of town, her mind racing. Sitting at the kitchen table, she stared at the sleek black phone. Axel's parting words echoed in her mind. "We'll be back." With a deep breath, she flipped the phone open and pressed the button Eric had marked with a single word. "Call." Miles away, on a naval base, Eric Hartwell's secure phone buzzed on his desk. He glanced at the screen and froze. His mother had never used this number. Not once. He answered immediately. "Mom, what's wrong?" Mary's voice was steady but tinged with urgency. "Eric, I need your help. They're coming for the town." Eric's expression hardened. "I'll be there as soon as I can." As the call ended, Mary felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. Help was on the way, but so was danger. Meadow Ridge was her home, and she would protect it. But she couldn't do it alone. Not this time. In the stillness of the farmhouse, Mary whispered a prayer, knowing that the days ahead would test her in ways she had never imagined. A seal's oath. Eric Hartwell stood on the deck of the U.S. Valor, his silhouette sharp against the vast ocean. The sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the water in hues of fiery orange and gold. The rhythmic crashing of waves against the hull had always been a source of calm for him. But not today. His mother's call echoed in his mind, every word laced with a quiet urgency she had tried to mask. "They're coming for the town." He hadn't asked for details. He didn't need them. The Iron Tide was a name he had encountered before, buried in reports of small-town intimidation and territorial expansions. But he hadn't known they'd reached Meadow Ridge. His Meadow Ridge. Eric's fingers curled into fists. The town was more than a dot on a map. It was home. It was where his father had taught him to throw a football in the backyard, where he'd climbed the old oak tree with friends, and where his mother had stood firm through every storm life had thrown at her. If the Iron Tide thought they could take it without resistance, they were about to learn a hard lesson. "Commander Hartwell," called a voice behind him. Eric turned to see Lieutenant Marcus "Hawk" Hawkins, his second-in-command and closest friend. Hawk's expression was serious, though there was a flicker of curiosity in his sharp brown eyes. "You've been quiet since that call." Eric exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's my mom. She's in trouble. Some biker gang is harassing the town." Hawk raised an eyebrow. "The Iron Tide?" "Yeah," Eric said grimly. "They're not just some rowdy gang. They're organized. I've seen their name in reports. Extortion, smuggling, you name it." Hawk crossed his arms. "So what's the plan? You're not thinking of going in solo, are you?" "I don't have time to wait for bureaucracy," Eric said. "The town doesn't have the resources to fight back. Hawk studied Eric for a moment before a slow grin spread across his face. "You know I can't let you go alone." Eric smirked. "I was counting on that." By the time the sun had fully set, Eric had assembled a small team of trusted SEALs. Hawk was the first to volunteer, followed by Jack Steele Ramirez, a demolitions expert, and Sarah Ghost Nguyen, the team's stealth and infiltration specialist. Together, they made up a formidable squad, their camaraderie forged in countless missions. The flight to Meadow-Ridge. The team boarded a military transport plane under the cover of darkness. Eric briefed them on the situation during the flight, pulling up what little intelligence he had on the Iron Tide. "They're more than a gang," Eric explained, showing them satellite images of Iron Tide activity in nearby towns. They'd been expanding aggressively, using intimidation and violence to take over small towns. Once they have control, they use those towns as hubs for smuggling and other illegal activities. "Why Meadow-Ridge?" Steele asked, leaning forward. "Strategic location," Eric replied. "It's a crossroads town. They can move goods quickly through the state without attracting attention. My guess is they plan to establish a base there." Ghost's voice was calm but serious. "And your mom?" "She's holding the line," Eric said. "But she can't do it alone." Hawk frowned. "If they're this organized, we're looking at more than a dozen members, possibly armed. They won't roll over just because a few locals push back." Eric nodded. "That's why we're going in smart. This isn't just about fighting them. It's about empowering the town to stand up for itself. Meadow-Ridge doesn't need us to save it. They need us to give them the tools to save themselves." Back in Meadow-Ridge, Mary Hartwell wasn't one to idle. After her call with Eric, she had wasted no time rallying the community. The town's old church became a makeshift meeting hall, where neighbors gathered to discuss their options. "They're bullies," Mary said, standing at the front of the room. "And bullies rely on fear. If we show them we're not afraid, we can take back our town." Sheriff Bill Timmons stood beside her, nodding. "She's right. But we need a plan. We can't just confront them head-on." Jack Mason, a burly farmer with a shotgun slung over his shoulder, spoke up. "What about when they come back? They'll be armed. Are we supposed to fight them with pitchforks?" Mary's gaze was steady. "My son is coming. He's a Navy SEAL, and he's bringing help." The room murmured with a mix of hope and skepticism. Meadow-Ridge wasn't used to relying on outside forces, even if one of their own was leading the charge. The SEALs arrive. Eric and his team landed at a private airstrip 2 hours outside Meadow-Ridge, where a contact had arranged for a nondescript SUV. The ride into town was quiet, the weight of the mission pressing on them. As they approached Meadow-Ridge, Eric felt a pang of nostalgia. The rolling fields and familiar landmarks were unchanged, but the tension in the air was palpable. The market square, normally bustling with life, was eerily quiet. They pulled into the Hartwell farm under the cover of night. Mary was waiting on the porch, her hands clasped tightly together. When Eric stepped out of the car, she rushed to him, pulling him into a fierce hug. "I'm so glad you're here," she whispered. Eric held her for a moment before pulling back. "We'll handle this, Mom. I promise." Mary nodded, her eyes misty. "They don't know what they're up against." Eric introduced his team, and the group quickly got to work. They set up a temporary command center in the farmhouse's barn, using satellite communications and portable surveillance equipment to gather intel on the Iron Tide. Laying the groundwork. The first step was assessing the enemy. Ghost and Steele conducted a nighttime reconnaissance mission, slipping into the shadows like phantoms. They observed the Iron Tide's hideout, a dilapidated warehouse on the edge of town. 20 bikers, give or take, Ghost reported when they returned. Heavily armed. They'd got security cameras and a lookout on the roof. Eric frowned. They're not amateurs. But that means they've got a system. Systems can be broken. The next step was rallying the town. Eric held a meeting at the church where he outlined his plan. "We're not asking you to fight them head-on," Eric said. But we need your help. You know this town better than anyone. That gives us an edge." He assigned roles based on each person's skills. Farmers rigged traps along key roads using hay bales and old machinery. Hunters volunteered to act as lookouts, using their familiarity with the woods to monitor Irontide movements. Even the town's teenagers contributed, setting up a makeshift surveillance network using drones and cameras. A close call. During one of their patrols, Hawk and Steele encountered a small Irontide patrol on the outskirts of town. The bikers were scouting, likely planning their next move. The encounter was brief but tense, a reminder that the Irontide wouldn't back down without a fight. Hawk radioed Eric. "They're testing us. They want to see how far they can push." Eric's response was firm. "Let them. We'll be ready." The calm before the storm. As dawn approached, the town stood united. The once frightened community was now a network of resistance, each person playing their part. Eric and his team had brought more than their skills. They had brought hope. Mary watched from her porch as the first light of morning painted the sky. Eric stood beside her, his expression resolute. "Do you think we're ready?" she asked. Eric nodded. "More than ready. They'll regret ever stepping foot in Meadow Ridge." Mary smiled faintly, her heart swelling with pride. "Your father would be so proud of you." Eric placed a hand on her shoulder. "This is our home. No one takes it from us." As the sun rose, the Irontide prepared to make their next move, but they had underestimated the strength of Meadow Ridge and the resolve of a Navy SEAL determined to protect it. Laying the trap. The early morning sun cast long shadows over Meadow Ridge as the town began its most critical preparations. From the outside, it looked like an ordinary, sleepy farming community, but beneath the surface, something extraordinary was unfolding. With Eric Hartwell and his SEAL team at the helm, the townsfolk were transforming into a cohesive unit, ready to defend their homes. The Irontide had no idea what awaited them. A town transformed. Eric stood on the porch of his family's farmhouse, gazing at the landscape that was once his childhood playground. Now, it was a battlefield in the making. Beside him, his second-in-command, Hawk, scribbled notes on a map spread over a makeshift table. "This town is a tactician's dream," Hawk said, tapping the map. "Narrow roads, choke points, plenty of cover. If we use it right, we can turn it into a maze for the Irontide." Eric nodded. "The key is coordination. We don't need to win a full-on fight. We just need to make the cost of staying here too high for them." Mary joined them, her hands on her hips. "We've got every able-bodied person helping. Jack's rigging the hay bales, and Martha's boys are setting up the drones." Eric smiled at his mother's determination. "You've done more than enough, Mom. Now let us handle the rest." Mary raised an eyebrow. "This is my town too, Eric. I'm not sitting this out." Building a defense. The Hartwell barn became the operational hub for the resistance. Inside, tables were covered with maps, radios, and supplies. Eric's team worked tirelessly, training the townsfolk in basic defensive tactics and assigning roles based on their skills. Farmers. They were in charge of creating obstacles and choke points. Old tractors, broken fences, and stacks of hay bales were repurposed into roadblocks. The farmers knew every ditch and hidden path, giving them an advantage over the bikers. Hunters. With their experience in the woods, the hunters became the town's eyes and ears. Armed with binoculars and rifles, they took positions in tree stands and hidden lookout points. Teenagers. Equipped with drones and walkie-talkies, the younger residents acted as a surveillance team, providing real-time updates on the Irontide's movements. Mary and the core team. Mary organized the civilians who couldn't fight, ensuring they had safe zones and emergency supplies. The church basement and old storm cellars were converted into shelters. Steele worked with Jack Mason to rig improvised traps along the main roads leading into town. They buried tire spikes under loose dirt and set up tripwires connected to fireworks, which would serve as both a distraction and a signal. I never thought my tractor would be a weapon, Jack said with a chuckle, patting the rusted machine they had positioned as a barricade. Steele grinned. Welcome to modern warfare, Jack. Reconnaissance in the shadows. As the town prepared, Ghost and Hawk ventured into the Iron Tide's territory under the cover of darkness. Their target, the gang's warehouse on the outskirts of Meadow Ridge. The warehouse was a sprawling, dilapidated structure surrounded by motorcycles and a few black SUVs. Floodlights illuminated the perimeter, and 2 guards patrolled the entrance. Ghost studied the scene through binoculars, her sharp eyes catching every detail. They'd got a pattern, she whispered to Hawk. 2-minute rotations, one on the north side, one on the west. Think we can slip through? Hawk asked. Ghost smirked. Easier than stealing candy from a baby. The two moved like shadows, bypassing the guards and slipping into the warehouse through a side window. Inside, they found stacks of crates labeled with cryptic codes and a few open containers revealing weapons, assault rifles, grenades, and even military-grade equipment. Hawk whistled softly. This isn't just intimidation. They're running an armory. Ghost photographed everything with her phone, ensuring they had evidence to expose the Iron Tide's operation. As they prepared to leave, voices echoed from an upper level. Axel says we hit the town tomorrow night, one voice said. Take out their leaders, make an example. About time, another replied. I'm tired of playing nice. Ghost and Hawk exchanged a glance. The timetable had just moved up. The warning. Back at the Hartwell farm, Eric listened intently as Ghost and Hawk relayed their findings. The Iron Tide wasn't just posturing. They were preparing for an all-out assault. They're coming tomorrow night, Ghost said. And they're bringing enough firepower to level half the town. Eric's jaw tightened. Then we'll be ready. He turned to his team. Steele, double-check every trap and barricade. Hawk, I want more eyes on the woods. Ghost, keep monitoring their movements. If anything changes, I want to know. Mary placed a hand on Eric's arm. Do you think we can hold them off? Eric met her gaze. We don't need to beat them, Mom. We just need to make sure they know Meadow Ridge isn't worth the fight. The calm before the storm. The night before the expected attack, Meadow Ridge was eerily quiet. The townsfolk gathered at the church for a final meeting. Eric stood at the front, his SEAL team flanking him. We've done everything we can to prepare, he began. Now it's about standing together. The Iron Tide thrives on fear. They think they can break us. Let's show them they're wrong. The room filled with murmurs of agreement. Farmers nodded grimly. Hunters tightened their grips on their rifles, and even the teenagers stood taller. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for their home. After the meeting, Eric walked with his mother back to the farmhouse. The stars overhead were brilliant, undisturbed by the light pollution of the city. Mary glanced at her son, her face soft in the moonlight. You've grown into a fine man, she said. Your father would be so proud. Eric smiled faintly. I just want to make sure you're safe. Mary stopped and turned to face him. I've been safe because of you, Eric. You've always looked out for me. But this town, it's more than just me. It's all of us. And we're not backing down. The first move. Before dawn, the Iron Tide made their first move. A small patrol of bikers approached the town, their engines breaking the silence. They didn't get far. As they rolled onto the main road, the first bike hit a buried spike strip, sending the rider tumbling. Fireworks erupted from nearby fields, startling the others. Panicked, the bikers turned to retreat, but a tractor blocked their path, forcing them to abandon their bikes and flee on foot. From his vantage point, Eric watched through binoculars. They're testing us, he muttered. Let them. They'll find out soon enough. A fateful message. Later that morning, Axel Kane received word of his patrol's failure. He stood in the center of the warehouse, his scared face twisted in anger. They're playing games, he growled. Fine. If they want to fight, we'll give them a war. Axel turned to his men, his voice cold and commanding. "Gear up. We're taking Meadow Ridge tonight." Back in the town, Eric and his team worked tirelessly to finalize their defenses. The air buzzed with anticipation and determination. Meadow Ridge was ready for the fight of its life. As dusk fell, the townsfolk gathered in their positions, their nerves steeled by the knowledge that they weren't alone. Eric moved through the ranks, offering words of encouragement and final instructions. Then, as the first stars appeared in the sky, the low rumble of motorcycles echoed in the distance. The Iron Tide was coming. The Iron Tide strikes. The first rumble of motorcycles reached Meadow Ridge, just as the last sliver of sunlight disappeared below the horizon. The sound, like rolling thunder, grew louder with each passing second, shaking windows and turning stomachs. From the bell tower of the old church, 16-year-old Mason Henderson gripped a pair of binoculars with trembling hands. His voice cracked over the radio. "They're coming. A lot of them." Eric Hartwell, stationed near the town square, adjusted his headset. "Stay calm, Mason. Remember your training. Keep your eyes on them, and report what you see." Mason exhaled shakily and focused on the distant headlights cutting through the darkness. "There's at least 20 bikes, 2 trucks behind them. SUVs, 2 blacked-out windows." Eric exchanged a glance with Hawk, who crouched nearby with a scoped rifle. "They brought more than we expected," Hawk muttered. "Doesn't matter," Eric said, his voice firm. "They're walking into a trap." The advance. The Iron Tide's convoy rolled into the outskirts of Meadow Ridge, their engines roaring defiantly. Axel Kane rode at the head of the pack, his hulking frame a menacing silhouette against the glare of the headlights. Behind him, his lieutenants followed, each one armed to the teeth. Axel raised a hand, and the convoy slowed to a crawl. He scanned the darkened town ahead, his sharp eyes searching for signs of life. The streets were eerily quiet, the windows of homes darkened as if the town had been abandoned. "Where are they?" one of his men growled. "They're hiding," Axel said with a sneer. "But we'll smoke them out." He motioned to the trucks, and their engines revved as they pulled forward, loaded with armed men ready to impose the Iron Tide's rule. But just as the trucks reached the first intersection, there was a deafening pop, followed by a metallic screech. The lead truck swerved violently, its front tires shredded by a hidden spike strip. "Ambush!" shouted one of the bikers. Fireworks exploded overhead, bathing the street in bursts of red and blue light. Startled, the bikers instinctively scattered, some of them losing control of their motorcycles on the oil-slicked road. Axel roared in frustration, kicking his bike into gear. "Spread out. Find them." The resistance begins. From their hidden positions, the townsfolk launched their counterattack. Farmers and hunters, stationed in the upper floors of barns and shops, took precise shots at the Iron Tide's tires, disabling more bikes and vehicles. Mason relayed movements from the bell tower, his voice growing steadier with each report. "They're splitting up. 4 heading toward Main Street. The rest are circling back to the trucks." Eric keyed his radio. "Stay focused, everyone. Engage only when you're sure. Let them come to us." Jack Mason, stationed behind an overturned tractor near the square, grinned as he saw a group of bikers approaching. He waited until they were within range before triggering the tripwire he'd set earlier. A hidden hay bale catapult released, slamming into the lead biker and sending him sprawling. "That'll teach you to mess with a farmer," Jack muttered, reloading his shotgun. Axel's countermove. Meanwhile, Axel regrouped with his lieutenants near the town's grain silos. His men were rattled but not broken. "They've got traps set up everywhere," one of them growled. "This isn't some scared little town. It's a game of patience," Axel said coldly. "They'll slip up eventually. And when they do, we crush them." He barked orders, splitting his forces into smaller units to probe the town's defenses. Axel himself led a group toward the church, drawn by the bell tower's vantage point. A deadly standoff. Eric watched Axel's movements from his hidden position near the square. Through his night vision binoculars, he saw the gang leader moving with calculated precision, his men clearing obstacles and advancing cautiously. "Hawk, they're heading for the church," Eric said over the radio. "We can't let them take the tower." "I'm on it," Hawk replied. He repositioned to cover Mason's location, his rifle trained on Axel's group. Ghost joined him, slipping through the shadows with her silenced pistol at the ready. As Axel approached the church, he raised a hand to signal his men to halt. Something felt off. The air was too still, the silence unnatural. "Hold here," he ordered, scanning the area. That's when the first shot rang out. Hawk's bullet struck the ground inches from Axel's boot, a deliberate warning. "Back off." Hawk's voice boomed from his hidden position. "You're not taking another step." Axel smirked, unfazed. "You think one good shot's enough to scare us? You don't know who you're dealing with." Escalation. The Iron Tide responded with a barrage of gunfire, their bullets tearing into the church's walls and shattering windows. Mason ducked behind the bell tower's railing, his heart racing. "I can't stay here," he shouted into the radio. "You can do this, Mason," Eric said firmly. "You're our eyes. Stay low and keep feeding us intel." On the ground, Ghost flanked Axel's group, taking down two of his men with swift, silent shots. Hawk continued to provide cover fire, forcing the bikers to scatter. But Axel was no ordinary thug. He moved like a predator, using the chaos to his advantage. With a hand signal, he directed a small team to circle around the church, aiming to outflank their defenders. Eric anticipated the move. He led Steele and two local hunters to intercept, cutting through an alley to get ahead of Axel's men. When the bikers emerged, they found themselves face to face with Eric's team. "Drop your weapons," Eric ordered, his voice cold and commanding. The bikers hesitated, their hands twitching toward their holsters. Steele stepped forward, his shotgun leveled. "I wouldn't," he said, "unless you want to find out how good my aim is." The bikers dropped their guns, but Axel was already retreating, barking orders into his radio. "Fall back to the trucks. Regroup and hit them harder." Turning the tide. As the Iron Tide regrouped, they found themselves increasingly isolated. The traps, the precise rifle fire, and the town's intimate knowledge of the terrain had taken a toll on their numbers and morale. Near the grain silos, Axel's remaining forces tried to consolidate their position, using their vehicles as cover. But Eric wasn't about to let them recover. "They're pinned at the silos," Eric said over the radio. "Steele, get that surprise ready." Steele grinned as he crouched near a hidden stash of homemade explosives. "Thought you'd never ask." With a loud boom, one of the trucks exploded, sending the Iron Tide scrambling. The blast was more smoke and noise than damage, but it served its purpose. Chaos. Axel's last stand. With his forces in disarray, Axel realized the trap Meadowridge had set. He roared in frustration, kicking over a crate of ammunition. "Fall back," he shouted. "We'll regroup outside town and come back stronger." But as Axel and his remaining men tried to retreat, they found every road blocked, every escape route cut off. The farmers, hunters, and seals had created a perfect noose around the Iron Tide. Eric and Hawk closed in on Axel's position, their weapons trained on the gang leader. "It's over, Axel," Eric said. "Drop the act, drop your weapon, and walk away with your life." Axel sneered, his eyes wild. "You think this is over? You think a bunch of farmers and their Navy golden boy can stop me?" Eric stepped closer, his tone icy. "This isn't about me. It's about this town, and you'll never own it." Axel lunged, drawing a hidden knife, but Eric was faster. With a swift movement, he disarmed the gang leader and brought him to the ground, pinning him with practiced ease. "It's over," Eric repeated, this time with finality. Victory, but at a cost. As dawn broke over Meadowridge, the Iron Tide lay defeated. The remaining bikers were rounded up by the sheriff, their weapons and vehicles confiscated. Axel and his lieutenants were handed over to state authorities, their criminal empire exposed. But the victory had come at a cost. Several townsfolk were injured, and the scars of the battle were visible in the shattered windows and scorched fields. Yet, despite the damage, Meadowridge stood strong. As the sun rose higher, the townsfolk gathered in the square, weary but triumphant. Eric looked out at the faces of his neighbors, his mother standing proudly beside him. "They underestimated us," Mary said, her voice steady. "They thought they could take this town because we were small. They didn't realize how big our hearts are." Eric nodded, his resolve unwavering. "And they never will again." The final stand. The smoke from the night's skirmish still hung over Meadowridge as the morning sun rose, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold. The battle had left its mark on the town: shattered windows, burned-out vehicles, and scars in the hearts of its people. But the iron tide wasn't finished. Eric Hartwell leaned against the porch railing of his family's farmhouse, watching the sunrise with grim determination. His SEAL team and the townsfolk had bought a hard-earned victory. But the fight wasn't over. Not yet. A dire warning. Sheriff Bill Timmons arrived in the early morning, his cruiser kicking up dust as it pulled into the Hartwell driveway. His face was pale, his usual calm demeanor replaced with visible worry. "They're regrouping," he said as he stepped out of the car. "Got word from one of my deputies stationed on the old highway. Axel called in reinforcements." Eric straightened. "How many?" Bill swallowed hard. "At least 20 more riders, armed, angry, and coming straight for us. They'll be here by nightfall." Eric exchanged a glance with Hawk, who had been sitting on the porch cleaning his rifle. "They're not giving up," Hawk muttered. "Typical. Bullies hate losing." Eric nodded. "We need to fortify the town. Fast." Preparing for the final fight, the call went out, and Meadowridge's residents gathered once more at the church. Eric stood before them, his presence commanding but calm. "This is it," he said. "The iron tide is bringing everything they've got. If we hold them here, we end this for good. If we fail—" He let the sentence hang in the air. Mary Hartwell stepped forward, her voice steady. "We won't fail. This is our home. We'll fight for it with everything we have." The room erupted in cheers and determined nods. The townsfolk were tired, but their resolve had only hardened. Fortifying Meadowridge. Eric divided the town into teams, each with a specific role in the defense effort. Farmers reinforced barricades and created new obstacles along key roads. Old combines and tractors were dragged into strategic positions, creating impenetrable walls of steel. Hunters positioned themselves in the woods and on rooftops, their rifles trained on likely entry points. Teenagers deployed drones and set up new surveillance cameras, ensuring the town had eyes everywhere. Volunteers dug trenches and reinforced shelters to protect the vulnerable. Meanwhile, Eric and his SEAL team prepared for the inevitable confrontation. Ghost set up sniper positions, Hawk organized supply catches, and Steel rigged new traps and explosives along the town's perimeter. The calm before the storm. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Meadowridge fell silent. The townsfolk, hidden in their positions, held their breath. The quiet was suffocating, broken only by the occasional chirp of a cricket or the rustle of leaves in the wind. Mary walked through the farmhouse, her hands trembling as she lit a candle. She paused in the living room, where a photograph of her late husband and a younger Eric sat on the mantel. She touched the frame gently, drawing strength from the memories. Outside, Eric adjusted his night vision goggles, scanning the road leading into town. Hawk crouched beside him, his rifle at the ready. "You think they'll come?" Hawk asked. Eric's jaw tightened. "They'll come. Axel's not the type to back down." The iron tide's arrival. The rumble of engines shattered the stillness of the night. The iron tide rolled into Meadowridge like a storm, their motorcycles roaring like thunder. Axel Kane rode at the head of the convoy, flanked by his reinforcements, He wore a sneer of confidence, his scared face illuminated by the headlights of his bike. As the gang entered the outskirts of town, they were met with silence. No townsfolk, no resistance, just empty streets and darkened windows. "They're hiding," Axel growled. "Fan out. Flush them out." The bikers spread through the town in small groups, their movements precise and calculated. They were professionals, hardened by years of criminal activity. But Meadowridge had something they didn't: home field advantage. The trap springs. The first explosion ripped through the night, startling the bikers. One of the SUVs hit a buried pressure plate, flipping onto its side in a burst of fire and smoke. The bikers closest to the blast scattered, shouting in confusion. From the rooftops, the hunters opened fire, their shots precise and controlled. Tires were punctured, engines disabled. The Iron Tide's convoy quickly devolved into chaos. "Fall back to the square," Axel shouted, rallying his men. "Regroup and take control." But every street they turned down was blocked by barricades, traps, or the townsfolk themselves. Steel detonated a series of explosives, cutting off their escape routes and forcing them into a choke point near the grain silos. Axel's fury. Axel dismounted his bike, his face twisted in rage. "Enough of this," he roared. He grabbed a radio from one of his lieutenants. "Bring in the big guns." Moments later, one of the SUVs rolled forward, its rear doors swinging open to reveal a mounted heavy machine gun. Axel's men aimed it toward the town square, ready to unleash devastation. Eric watched from his position and keyed his radio. "Hawk, Ghost, take out that gun." From her sniper perch, Ghost exhaled slowly, her finger tightening on the trigger. Her shot rang out, striking the gunner and sending him sprawling. Hawk followed up with a barrage of fire, forcing Axel's men to retreat from the SUV. The final confrontation. With his forces dwindling, Axel made a desperate move. He led a small group of his most loyal men toward the Hartwell farmhouse, determined to make an example of the Hartwell family. Eric anticipated the move. He and Hawk intercepted Axel's group near the farmhouse, engaging in a brutal firefight. The SEALs' training proved superior, but Axel was relentless. Eric faced Axel in a one-on-one confrontation, their weapons discarded in the chaos. The two men fought with fists and knives, their movements calculated and deadly. "You think you've won," Axel snarled, throwing a punch. "This town is nothing. You're nothing." Eric blocked the punch and delivered a devastating counterstrike. "This town is everything, and you'll never take it." With a final decisive move, Eric disarmed Axel and brought him to the ground, pinning him with a knee to the chest. Axel struggled, but it was over. Victory, but not without sacrifice. As dawn broke over Meadowridge, the battle was won. The Iron Tide lay defeated, their leaders captured, and their vehicles destroyed. The town stood battered but unbroken, its spirit stronger than ever. Eric walked through the town square, his SEAL team at his side. The townsfolk emerged from their shelters, cheering and embracing one another. Mary ran to Eric, pulling him into a tight hug. "You did it," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "No," Eric said, looking around at the resilient faces of Meadowridge. "We did it." Rebuilding and renewal. As the sun climbed higher, the townsfolk began the process of rebuilding. The scars of the battle would remain, but so would the bonds forged in the fight for their home. Meadowridge had faced the storm and emerged stronger for it. Eric stood with his team, watching as the sheriff loaded the Iron Tide into waiting police vans. Hawk clapped him on the shoulder. "Not bad for a bunch of farmers." Eric smiled faintly. "They're more than that. They're warriors." Rebuilding and renewal. The morning after the Iron Tide's defeat, Meadowridge stood in the golden light of dawn, its scars exposed but its spirit unbroken. Smoke still rose from a few damaged buildings, the acrid scent mingling with the fresh smell of overturned earth. Yet the people of the town moved with quiet determination, their resolve etched into every action as they began the process of rebuilding. Eric Hartwell stood in the town square, his eyes scanning the scene. Farmers used their tractors to clear debris from the roads, while teenagers with soot-streaked faces hauled splintered wood to a growing pile. The church bell, cracked from a stray bullet, rang faintly as Mason Henderson climbed down from the tower, his youthful face lined with a newfound maturity. "Not bad, Mason," Eric said, clapping the teenager on the shoulder. "You kept your cool when it mattered." Mason smiled sheepishly. "I was scared out of my mind." "That's what courage is," Eric replied. "Doing what needs to be done, even when you're scared." The town's recovery begins. Sheriff Bill Timmons coordinated efforts to secure the remaining Iron Tide members, who sat handcuffed in the back of police vans. The gang's weapons, vehicles, and supplies had been confiscated, ensuring they would no longer pose a threat. "We've got state police on their way to take these guys off our hands," Bill said to Eric. "But I don't think we'll be seeing any more trouble from the likes of them." Eric nodded. The Iron Tide relied on intimidation. "We've shown them what happens when people fight back." As the sheriff walked away, Mary Hartwell appeared, her arms full of bandages and supplies. "Eric," she said, handing him a cup of coffee, "you've been on your feet all night. Sit for a minute." Eric smiled and took the coffee but remained standing. "I'll rest later. Right now, the town needs us." Mary shook her head with a soft laugh. "You're just like your father, stubborn to a fault. A united community." The day unfolded in a rhythm of resilience and cooperation. Eric's SEAL team worked alongside the townsfolk, their military precision blending seamlessly with the grit and ingenuity of Meadow-Ridge's people. Ghost helped reinforce the church's roof, her quiet demeanor and deft hands earning the respect of the older farmers. Steele assisted Jack Mason in repairing a tractor that had been damaged during the battle. The two men bonded over stories of farm life and military exploits. Hawk organized a cleanup crew, his booming voice and sharp humor lifting spirits as they cleared the debris from Main Street. By mid-afternoon, the town square was transformed from a battleground into a symbol of renewal. Broken windows were boarded up, barricades were dismantled, and the scars of the fight were slowly erased, reflecting on the cost. Despite the victories, the cost of the battle was evident. Several townsfolk had sustained injuries, and the memory of the Iron Tide's violence lingered like a shadow. Eric visited the injured in the makeshift clinic set up in the church basement, offering words of encouragement and gratitude. "You all fought harder than anyone could have asked," he said to Jack Mason, whose arm was in a sling. "You proved what this town is made of." Jack chuckled through the pain. "Just doing what needed to be done, son. But I'm glad you were here. Couldn't have done it without you." Eric's expression softened. "This was your victory too, Jack. It's the strength of this town that made it possible. A new future." As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the fields, Meadow-Ridge gathered in the square for a quiet ceremony. Mary Hartwell stood at the center, her silver hair glinting in the fading light. She held a small, hand-carved wooden plaque that read, "To those who stood together, Meadow-Ridge, stronger than ever." "This isn't just about rebuilding," Mary said, her voice carrying over the crowd. "It's about remembering who we are and what we've accomplished. We're not just a town. We're a family. And no one can take that from us." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, the unity of the moment palpable. Eric's farewell. As the night settled in, Eric and his SEAL team prepared to leave. Their mission was complete, and it was time for Meadow-Ridge to stand on its own. "You sure you don't want to stay a little longer?" Mary asked, her voice tinged with sadness. Eric hugged her tightly. "I'll always be a phone call away, Mom, but you don't need me here. You've got the town, and they've got you." Mary's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "You've done more than protect us, Eric. You've reminded us what we're capable of." Eric smiled. "That's all I ever wanted." As the SEALs loaded into their vehicle, the townsfolk gathered to see them off. Mason ran up to Eric, his expression earnest. Do you think I could be a SEAL someday? Eric knelt to meet Mason's eyes. If you work hard and never give up, you can do anything. A town transformed. As the SEALs drove away, Meadow stood united, its people more connected than ever. They had faced the storm together, and in doing so, they had discovered a strength they hadn't known they possessed. Eric glanced back at the town fading into the distance, his heart full. He had come home to protect it, but in the end, Meadow had protected itself. It wasn't just a town anymore. It was a symbol of resilience, a beacon of hope, and it would stand strong, no matter what came next.